It looks like we're ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to David Godwin to begin.
All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session on fire history. We have 5 speakers this morning who will be covering a wide range of topics that will take us from the longleaf pine forest of the southeastern United States and all the way up to the Cascades of the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. So my name is David Godwin, and I am a director of the Southern Fire Exchange program, part of the Fire Science Exchange Network with the University of Florida, and I'll be moderating this session this morning. It's a pleasure. I consider myself a fire history groupie, but not a researcher, so I'm really looking forward to it. So if you do have any questions, please, or comments, please put them into the Whova window in your browser, and we'll try and get through those in the time that we have today. So first up, our first speaker is Dan Brumm. He is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. All right, Dan, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. My name is Dan Brumm, and I am going to share some of my thesis research with you all, which is about a fire history reconstruction in Itasca State Park. I've been working with Kurt Kiffmueller, who's my advisor at the University of Minnesota. And before I really get rolling here, I want to talk about something that's very important. Because I'm a Euro-American, and I'm going to talk about a landscape today that has been influenced by Native peoples in ways that can't really be measured or quantified. I feel uncomfortable at times working in a culturally sensitive part of Minnesota because some of these places that I'll be talking about today were very important to communities that in many ways are now kind of next door neighbors. So within the bounds of this fire history, the Sioux and the Ojibwe peoples lived in this area, and over time, Euro-Americans have constructed an identity for northern Minnesota that is kind of rooted in the absence of people. And that really wasn't the case. You know, there were people here, and I think that for us to feel respectful as researchers and scientists, we need to spend some time learning about the people that were here before us. So when I talk about the upper Mississippi River headwaters, I'm talking about this circled area here. I'll be talking about 2 specific locations. There we go. Specifically, I'll be talking about 2 locations. My main focus is in Itasca State Park, but I'll also talk about an unpublished fire history on Star Island in Cass Lake. So these are 2 areas with a long history of human influence, and Euro-Americans have really been drawn to this area over time. So Euro-Americans were very enchanted with the pines of this region. It was kind of a focal point. And the park was established in 1891, essentially to protect the old growth pines at the Mississippi River headwaters. So pine protection meant, of course, keeping the loggers out, but it also meant keeping the fire out as well. So it was only just a matter of decades before the lack of pine regeneration in the park was deemed to be problematic. And we know today that fire exclusion and suppression had some role with that. So because of this long-standing Euro-American interest, there's been a lot of research and historical information published on this area, including pictures like this one from 1902. And these pictures really help show us how prominent pines once were on this landscape. These pictures from the past really show clearly, how different the park once looked, especially how different they are compared to the forest communities we see today. When we do talk about these modern forests, this is a pine stand from the park that is a pretty typical site. We have no pine regeneration. We have a lot of broadleaf species creeping up into the canopy, and we see increasing numbers every single year of wind-blown pines laying on the ground. So pines were once the focal point of this region and landscape, but if you ask me, I would tell you that from personal experience, the new characterizing feature are really, really thick, brushy understories like this one. So Minnesota can have some pretty intense weather events Droughts can be common in this region and can last from months to years. And it's interesting to note too that during periods of high precipitation, this landscape can become very fragmented by lakes and ephemeral wetlands. Cloud ground lightning is most common in June, July, and August in the evening and afternoon of those months. And it's really important to note for this region also that lightning is usually accompanied with a lot of rain. We don't get very much dry lightning in this area. So lightning fires do occur, but I think a lot of lightning ignitions are extinguished fairly quickly by the rain that accompanies those events. So let's start to transition to the fire history stuff. So with my work in Itasca, the three big things I wanted to focus on were increasing spatial coverage of sample collection in the park. I wanted to employ a method called cross dating, which I'll talk about shortly, and I wanted to look at fire seasonality as well. So I'm not the first person to research fire history in Itasca State Park using tree rings. However, these past studies were fairly limited in spatial coverage of the park itself. Additionally, there's this very important principle in dendrochronology called cross dating, and these earlier studies, they did not use cross dating. Cross dating wasn't used until 2004 when this group, the North American Dendroecological Field Week, came to the park and developed some fire history sites using cross dating and also looked at seasonality for the first time. So if you're not familiar with tree ring science or cross dating, this is essentially what I'm talking about. Hopefully it helps you understand. So trees growing relatively close to each other can have common overlapping ring width patterns. And these patterns, they help us identify with more confidence what years the tree rings were produced. Additionally, cross dating helps us be able to date dead pieces of wood that might be older than the living tree record. So if you're dating tree rings and you do not use cross dating, you're probably going to have some dating errors in there. And that's exactly what that native group found with these previous fire histories. They did not use cross dating, so the fire events that they were recording were off by 1 to 3 years. If you're not familiar with the methods for tree ring based cross dating, fire histories, we first head out into the field and we locate stumps like this one. In this region, we're primarily collecting red pine stumps that have fire scars that we can see here. We then collect cross section with a chainsaw or a handsaw, and we bring them back so we can sand them and mount them to plywood. So we sand them to about 1,000 grit sandpaper. Once the sanding has been completed, we can get them into the lab and under the microscope so we can see these fire scars. And I was able to date about 77 samples from the Itasca State Park area there. And we'll take a look at that fire history. So if you aren't familiar with fire charts, what we're looking at here, each one of these horizontal black bars represents one of those 77 samples. And the red triangles, those represents fire events that scarred at least 10% of the samples. And then these gray triangles represents fires that didn't quite meet that 10% threshold. Some interesting things from this history are that we have fires recorded from 1697 all the way up to the late 1800s, early 1900s, when fire suppression became pretty widespread. We also have a lot of synchronous fire events across the park, meaning that when a fire burned, we get a lot of replication of those of that event, excuse me. It also kind of indicates that when a fire burns in the park, usually a large part of the park or the entire park is affected. Additionally, we have a lot of short fire intervals in between a longer fire interval. If you're not familiar, a fire interval, that's the number of years in between two fire events. So we kind of have this repeating pattern of 2 to 3 fires in a 20-year period, and then we'll have several decades where very little or no fire will burn. If we look at just these fire intervals, we see that about 50% of the fires in Itasca had intervals of 20 years or less. So coincidentally, fires with intervals of 20 years or less, those are generally the types of fires that red pine like and can help lead to their natural regeneration. Additionally, too, in this region, the rate of fuel accumulation is fairly slow. So it can sometimes take longer than this 20-year period for fuel accumulations to be sufficient and conditions to be adequate for lightning fires to strike and be carried across the landscape. So in this region, these shorter fire intervals it can be something that indicates fire may not have been primarily lit by lightning. In terms of seasonality, I had some disagreement with the North American Dendroecological Field Week. They identified mostly dormant season fires, where my samples primarily had fire scars positioned on the early wood of the tree rings, indicating early growing season fires. Out of 266 individual fire scars, I could observe seasonality on 141, and like I mentioned, most recorded early wood fires. Something that is important to note about dormant season fires is that they can be a little bit ambiguous. You know, a dormant season fire could have been in the very late fall or the very early spring. So I think it's just something that's important to remember with tree rings. Sometimes we hope for really, really clear indications of fire seasonality, but with tree rings, sometimes it's a little bit more ambiguous than we would hope for. I would like to jump over to Star Island though and talk about how that fire history compares. First though, it's really important to note that there's a very well-established summer Ojibwe village site on Star Island in the early part of the 1800s. During that same time period, Itasca was also visited, but probably in a more seasonal way. There was this village site on the shores of Lake Itasca. However, it's thought that village site was not active or was active, excuse me, prior to the year 1750. So Star Island represents the fire history of a location with a lot of human impact and influence. And what we see here again are a lot of synchronous fire events. You know, when a fire burned on the island, generally a large part of the island was affected. We did only have one common year from Star Island to Itasca. So this essentially represents a unique and a different fire history from the Itasca area. Similar to the Itasca though, is we did have a lot of early season fires on the island, and we did have some more late season fires on the island than we did in Itasca. If we take a quick look at the fire intervals from Star Island, we do see again that about 50% of these intervals are burning at shorter intervals of 20 years or less. Now, I do have one more fire history that I want to talk about. Earlier this year, Dr. Sambaugh and some other folks published a fire history that also came from the headwaters. And this is really awesome because it's showing that we're continuing to learn more and more and more about fire and fire history in the Mississippi River headwaters area. So to do a kind of quick and dirty comparison with my fire history in Itasca, we had 8 fire years in common, but we had pretty different seasonalities. So this is something that leads me to believe these common years were actually separate fire events that burned during different seasons. Again, though, note that we have short fire intervals in this study as well. So that does appear to be something common across the entire region, that fire intervals were generally short. I would like to circle back to seasonality though, because there was not very clear agreement across the entire region for fire seasonality. So I started to look at these annual reports from the Minnesota Fire Warden. And I did this to try to identify common months of fire occurrence. So if we do look at just the months of fire occurrence, we see that about 55% of these fires, at least for these 15 years, burned in April, May, or June. And then we have a little bit of an increase in fire occurrence in September and October as well. As I kind of mentioned, my main curiosities are in the Itasca State Park area. So if we jump over there, we see a little bit different distribution where now half of the fires burned just in April and May. This is something that is supported by what I was finding with tree rings, but it's also interesting that in June, July, and August, when cloud ground lightning is most common, those were the 3 months when fire occurrence was lowest, at least for these 15 years. So that's something to also kind of support something I was mentioning earlier, that lightning may not have been the primary ignition source in this area because fire occurrence was low when lightning ignitions were high. I got to start wrapping up the presentation here now, but after I looked at these 3 fire histories, there were a few things that became clear. And it's that in the Mississippi River headwaters area, short fire intervals were most common, but we still have a lot of long fire intervals over the last 300 to 400 years. So obviously varying fire intervals can result in a lot of varying fire characteristics, especially when you start to consider how across this entire region, we were recording many different fire events. and seasonality of those fire events varies quite a bit from site to site. So with the most common fire seasonalities being in the dormant season and the early season, though, these seasonalities don't align, especially well with the seasonality of a lightning-driven fire regime, because as I mentioned a couple of times now, lightning occurrence seems to be, fire occurrence seems to be relatively low when lightning occurrence is high. So I want to leave this question up here for a moment because it's a very important question when studying fire, at least in the Mississippi River headwaters area. You know, in science, we need to quantify things. And because of that, I think it's been really common in the past for the influences of people on a landscape to be ignored because the influences of people can't very easily be assessed with numbers. So my parting thought goes back to something I was kind of getting at on my second slide, and that's to study fire and fire history in the Mississippi River headwaters area, and to do it in a respectful way. We need to focus on the influences of people too. We already have methods pretty well established to assess the influences of climate on fire, but the people were really important too. So don't forget the people. Thank you very much for listening. I've had a ton of help with this work, and some of you may know the help you get on projects like this, really make the work possible. So I owe a lot of thanks to these folks. Thank you again for your attention. I know I threw a lot of information out there, but I'll stop sharing my screen here shortly, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
All right, thank you, Dan. That was a great presentation. Yes, we do have time for questions. We have about 3 minutes remaining. So if you have any questions for Dan about his project or about the region there, you can go ahead and type them into the Whova window, either in the Q&A or in the chat. All right. Enjoyed your presentation there. Fascinating area to be working in. Love the take-home message talking about the importance of understanding the role of people in the history of fire in this region. Let's see. So any questions we have in here yet? Let's look it over here in the Q&A. Not yet. So, what if you were to carry this project forward, Dan, what would you like to do next?
Well, I mean, increasing sample collection is always like an obvious continuing point. But as I kind of mentioned, we have several fire histories from this region, and more will be published most likely. So in some ways, the fire history is excellent what we have. I think there needs to be a lot of work now, interacting with the indigenous communities that are still present in that area, especially considering the Chippewa National Forest was essentially superposed onto the Leech Lake Reservation. So, that comes to this whole other concept of what are you going to do in terms of management, collaboration with the people, the indigenous communities that are already present and have been present there are very important. So, continuing fire history work would be very important and significant, but I think a really potentially more important transition would be communicating with the people who are there and, establishing relationships that can continue into the future and last through, multiple generations of people.
Great. We've got some questions that have started to come in. Here's a question from Emma, and she's asking if you've had a chance to talk with any of the local indigenous groups in the area, and are they still using prescribed fire or cultural burning practices?
Yeah, I have had some opportunities. I haven't heard a ton from individuals of at least Leech Lake about like widespread or often use of prescribed fires. There are other communities in Minnesota that do actively use fire quite a bit, but I have been really fortunate to be able to have opportunities to talk with people from the Leech Lake Reservation who have very strong connections with their culture and who are willing to share that information, with a white person like me. So that really benefited me to have a better understanding on, the connections with the landscape from these indigenous communities, and just kind of opening my eyes because I have obviously a Euro-American perspective.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and thanks for your time today. We had a couple other questions that we didn't get to, and so y'all can follow up with Dan in the chat. during the next session or over email. So thanks, and we're going to move along to our next presentation.
Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Petar Simic, and Petar is a graduate student at Western Colorado University. And Petar will be talking about the historical role of fire in the sagebrush ecosystem in the Gunnison region of Colorado.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. So as David mentioned, my name is Petar Simic. I'm a second-year Master's of Science in Ecology student at Western Colorado University. And I'll be talking a little bit about my master's thesis project titled Using the Past and Present to Understand Fire Ecology and Sagebrush Habitats of the Gunnison Sage-Grouse. First, I'd like to acknowledge some of my collaborators, Dr. Ellis Margolis, USGS Fort Collins Science Center, Dr. Jonathan Koop from Western Colorado University, Brian Stevens from the BLM Gunnison Field Office, and Manny Lopez from NPS at Bandelier National Monument. I'd also like to show my gratitude for funding support from the USGS and BLM. Okay, so sagebrush landscapes are important ecosystems that occupy vast portions of Western North America, specifically 45 million acres. And despite the economic, cultural, and ecological importance of these systems, the historical role of fire in shaping these systems remains poorly understood. Additionally, sagebrush is critical for obligate species such as the threatened Gunnison sage-grouse. And 85% of the Gunnison sage-grouse's global population resides in the upper Gunnison Basin. So these sagebrush landscapes are particularly important for this threatened bird species. So we were interested in three things. One, we were interested in what was the historical role of fire in sagebrush landscapes within the Gunnison sage-grouse range. Two, how has that role changed? And three, how might this change influence Gunnison sage-grouse habitat? So to answer these questions, we had three objectives. One, we wanted to reconstruct the fire history over multiple centuries of the upper Gunnison Basin from tree ring fire scars. So this is using the past to understand the fire ecology of the upper Gunnison Basin. Two, we wanted to determine the effects of recent fires on vegetation within Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. So this is using the present. And then we wanted to combine those things, wanted to combine the fire history with modern fire effects to assess how Gunnison sage-grouse habitat may have changed over time. So fire history. So we sampled fire-scarred trees at 4 sagebrush ecotones across the upper Gunnison Basin. So obviously we were interested in the fire history of the sagebrush of the upper Gunnison Basin. However, we don't have the luxury of fire scars and sagebrush. So we used the next best thing, which is fire-scarred trees at these ecotones, 4 sagebrush ecotones. And we collected 177 tree ring samples from 10 sites. In this map here, you can see our 10 sites represented by these red stars. And you'll notice that all 10 sites are either within currently occupied Gunnison sage-grouse habitat or historically occupied Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. We then dated the year and seasonality of the fires using dendrochronological methods. So I won't get too much into the methodology of dendrochronology. I think Dan did a great job before me explaining that. But we use standard dendrochronological methods. And on the right here, here's a picture of one of our cross sections from a living ponderosa pine tree. And this particular tree was scarred twice, once in 1798 and once in 1842 by fire. On the left, we have a stump here, also taken from the upper Gunnison Basin. Both of these samples were from currently occupied Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. And this stump here has multiple fire scars. Additionally, we can date the seasonality of these fires based on the position of that fire scar within the annual ring. So on the left here, I have some information from our fire history study. We have our 10 fire history sites here on the left, represented by 3-letter plot codes. And on the bottom is a study area composite of the entire upper Gunnison Basin. So a composite of all 10 fire history sites. And we have number of fires, the mean fire return interval, median, min, and max. So our site level mean fire return interval, so our average of these averages, was 40 years across the 10 sites. So that allowed us to conclude that the upper Gunnison Basin had a history of repeated moderate frequency fire for over 500 years, which is really a significant finding and contradict a lot of assumptions made by land managers and academia in the upper Gunnison Basin. And so what we were interested in is the synchronous fire. So our site level mean fire return interval for fire burning synchronously between 2 or more sites was 23.6 years. So I want you all to remember this number right here, 23.6 years. And this is significant because, as I mentioned earlier, we are really interested in the fire history of the adjacent sagebrush at these ecotones, not necessarily the trees. So if we have two fire history sites with adjacent sagebrush in between those sites, and those two sites burned in the same year, we can assume that that adjacent sagebrush burned also in that year. So the synchronous fires occurred on average every 23.6 years in the Upper Gunnison Basin. We also observed an abrupt cessation of repeated fire circa 1900, followed by over a century that was essentially fire-free, which caused sites to miss up to 8 fires based on the historical fire frequency. So here's a Upper Gunnison Basin composite fire chart. On the left, we have our 10 fire history sites represented by the 3-letter plot codes. On the bottom, we have a multi-site fire represented here by the red line. So this represents the synchronous fires, the fires that happen at least 2 sites. The horizontal lines represent the sites recording fire, and the vertical tick marks represent fire scars, so when fires happen. And you'll notice here the abrupt shift in fire regime circa 1900 with Euro-American settlement and the altering of fire regimes through livestock grazing and fire suppression. And our orange vertical lines here represent the synchronous fires that happened in at least 2 sites. And this gray square represents our common area. So this is the time period we used for our analysis, 1690 to 1901, which is a period that most of the sites were recording fire. I also wanted to mention that when fire was most frequent, here in the 1800s, represented by this green shading, the population of the Gunnison sage-grouse was doing just fine. So the Gunnison Beckwith expedition was in 1853. So this fire frequency represents a time before Euro-American settlement, where fire was most frequent, and also the population numbers of the Gunnison sage-grouse were doing fine. So it's interesting that there's a correlation between the shift in fire regime and a beginning of decline of the Gunnison sage-grouse. So I thought that was worth noting. When fire was frequent, Gunnison sage-grouse was doing well. Okay, on to our fire history seasonality. So fire scars predominantly occurred in the spring, the dormant and the early wood. So 56%, the majority of our fire scars occurred in the dormant wood before the trees started growing. And this is consistent with the windy season in the Upper Gunnison Basin. So the springs are really windy here. And so with the majority of fires occurring at these ecotones during the windy season would be consistent with the wind blowing those fires into that adjacent sagebrush and burning that adjacent sagebrush. And this trend kind of gradually decreased until we get to the late wood, where we had a few fire scars in the late season. Additionally, we could not determine the seasonality of 15% of our fire scars due to level of rot and decay of those samples. And I also wanted to mention that the dormant wood, so the early season, the spring here in the Upper Gunnison Basin, is there's not very many ignition sources. So this would be consistent with indigenous burning cultural practices if we saw the majority of our fires happening in the dormant season. And this is because lightning ignition sources don't really start until the monsoon comes, usually in mid-July. So this would be consistent with indigenous burning here, interestingly enough. Okay, so to summarize our fire history findings, there's much more fire historically in the Upper Gunnison Basin within the Gunnison sage-grouse habitat than previously thought. Frequent synchronous fires are consistent with adjacent sagebrush burning. Most fires occurred in the spring when winds are high, possibly spreading fires to adjacent sagebrush, and spring fires could indicate human influence. So on to our modern fire effects part of our study. So we conducted vegetation surveys in 50 recently burned and 50 unburned sites. And in those 50 recently burned sites, we had 12 different fires from 8 distinct years, ranging from 2001 to 2021. On the left here, you can see an example of one of our fires. This is the Gold Basin fire, prescribed burn done by the BLM in 2008. The pink shading represents the fire perimeters, and the black dots represent our burned plots that we sampled. And the red dots represent our unburned plots that we sampled. So you could see for every burned plot we sampled a unburned plot that was adjacent to that fire perimeter. We used assessment, inventory, and monitoring protocols, AIM protocols, to assess vegetation structure and composition, which included line point intercept, continuous line intercept, and species richness. We then compared woody, graminoid, non-native forb, sagebrush, grass, among other variables between the burned and the unburned sites. So I wanted to show this picture. This is kind of a typical unburned sagebrush site in the Upper Gunnison Basin. This is that flat top, which is in currently occupied Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. So just notice the sagebrush here, how dense it is, the size of it, and how expansive and continuous it is. Now, I want you to compare that picture to these 4 pictures, which came from the Upper Gunnison Basin and represent different fire years. So in the top left corner, we have an area that burned in 2021. You can see here there's absolutely no shrubs, it's totally dominated by grasses and forbs. On the top right, this area burned 5 years ago, and we start to see some reestablishment of sagebrush and rubber rabbit brush. On the bottom left corner, this burned in 2013, and we start to see some substantial regeneration of sagebrush and rubber rabbit brush. Interestingly enough, kind of coming back as a 1-to-1 ratio between those 2 shrubs. And on the bottom right corner, this burned in 2002. And here we start to see some really significant establishment of sagebrush, still some dominance of grasses here, you can see. And we see some establishment of other shrubs like Persia tridentata here and a little bitter brush. Okay, so how did woody plant cover differ in the burned sites compared to the unburned sites? So here we're comparing all 50 burned sites compared to all 50 unburned sites. And we see that there's a significantly higher of woody plant cover in the unburned sites compared to the burned sites. If we look at woody plant cover with time since fire, we see a really nice gradual increase of woody plant cover with time since fire as it's slowly returning back to its pre-fire state. We see the opposite trend with herbaceous plant cover, where there's a significantly higher amount of herbaceous plant cover in the burned sites compared to the unburned sites. And interestingly enough, we don't really see much of a trend with herbaceous plant cover with time since fire. We see a really subtle decrease herbaceous plant cover with time since fire. However, it's nothing too dramatic. So we'll be adding some multivariate analysis here to account for the differences in productivity between sites, between fires, to really understand this relationship here. Now looking at sagebrush cover, we see a similar trend as we did to the woody plant cover, significantly higher amount of sagebrush cover in the unburned sites compared to the burned sites. And we see a really gradual increase of sagebrush cover with time since fire as it's slowly returning to its pre-fire state. Okay, so this is kind of the $1-million question. This is all good and well. However, what if this herbaceous plant cover is being accounted for as non-natives? So we did see a significantly higher amount of non-native plant cover in the burned sites than the unburned sites. However, the majority of non-native cover was crested wheatgrass at a single site. Cheatgrass is kind of the big question here. And cheatgrass was present at only 3 sites out of our 100, and 2 of those sites were unburned. So as of now, cheatgrass is not really a problem in the Upper Gunnison Basin, thanks to some pretty aggressive management by the BLM. And we'll see how that progresses into the future with drier and hotter conditions. So altogether, we only found 5 non-native species across our site from the 109 plant species across the 100 sites. And that was cheatgrass, crested wheatgrass, narrowleaf plantain, common dandelion, and yellow salsify. So we really didn't see too big of a problem with non-native plants in our burned sites. So to summarize our fire effects findings, recent burns exhibited reduced sagebrush cover and increases in graminoids relative to unburned sites. These shifts diminished over time, but persisted for at least 2 decades after the fire. All right, so let's tie this all together. So we got our fire history findings, our fire effects findings. So what does it all mean? So low severity and synchronous fire was frequent historically, with the majority of fires occurring during the windy season. So remember that number of 23.6 years. So on average, every 23.6 years, synchronous fires occurred in at least 2 of those fire history sites. And we saw effects of the fire persist at least 20 years after the burn. So put those 2 things together, we have a synchronous fire occurring every 23.6 years, and fire effects persistent 2 decades after the fire. we can conclude that the sagebrush landscapes of the upper Gunnison Basin looked a lot different historically than they do today. And in at least some portions of the upper Gunnison Basin, the historical condition was characterized by patchy mosaics of recent burns. So some study limitations: to what extent can we extrapolate these findings across sagebrush landscapes of the upper Gunnison Basin? So we're pretty confident in our fire history study of the sagebrush landscapes at these ecotones. However, how can we extrapolate these findings to the sagebrush that's at greater distances from these ecotones? So next steps would be to look at some GLO data, historical photos and surveys, do a sagebrush dendrochronology study to see if the establishment dates of that sagebrush correlate with the fire dates, and also doing a Gunnison sage-grouse habitat preference study to see if they do in fact prefer these burned areas. So I want to leave you with this final thought. What does this mean for the Gunnison sage-grouse? So I included this picture here of Gold Basin, which burned in 2008. And you'll notice here, it's characterized by this patchy mosaic. You kind of have older sagebrush here, younger sagebrush, and then areas dominated by grasses and forbs. So historically, the upper Gunnison Basin, according to our findings, probably looked a lot more like this than it does today. And this is interesting for the Gunnison sage-grouse because, of course, the Gunnison sage-grouse is a year-round resident of the upper Gunnison Basin, and it depends on these sagebrush landscapes. However, its habitat requirements vary seasonally, from barren landscapes for lecking all the way to dense sagebrush for brood rearing. So, as I mentioned before, when fires were most frequent in the upper Gunnison Basin, the Gunnison sage-grouse was doing fine. So, the idea here is that this patchy mosaic of post-fire sages, historically in the Gunnison sage-grouse, was critical for the Gunnison sage-grouse by supplying all these different habitat requirements in a small area, rather than forcing this bird to travel long distances to meet all its different habitat requirements. So I wanted to leave you with that thought, that fire historically may have been critical in maintaining Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. I'd like to now open up the floor for any questions if we have time, and if we don't, feel free to shoot me an email here.
All right, Petar, thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it. We do have about a little over 2 minutes, 3 minutes for questions. You can type those into the Q&A tool in Whova, or also type them in the chat and we will get to them. I'll check right now and see if we have any new ones. So have you had, this is my question, have you had any feedback from the area management community related to your findings?
Not yet. I mean, these findings are pretty new. So the fire effects stuff was done last summer. So we're just kind of in the thick of the analysis here right now. So yeah, I'm excited to communicate these results to our local land managers though.
Look and see if we have any more questions in here. Here's a question from Carla, and Carla says, what would need to be done to reintroduce more fire into this landscape?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And so a lot of people, especially researchers that do work in the Great Basin, kind of hear my results and really cringe when they think about introducing fire for sage-grouse conservation. Because in certain landscapes, certain sagebrush landscapes across the West, like in the Great Basin, they are seeing, hundreds of thousands of acres of cheatgrass come back after fires, which is really not great for sage-grouse conservation. So it's going to take some gradual steps to kind of introduce this idea in the context of sage-grouse regeneration, conservation. And things like this are challenging with the management implications, because when you're talking about a species that's already threatened and its numbers are already so low and unpredictable, reintroducing a disturbance like fire is just really risky. So it's going to take some risk taking on the part of these land managers, which a lot of them are kind of up for that challenge. And it's going to take some really kind of close monitoring, close observation, and really careful introduction of fire, which is being done in the Upper Gunnison Basin. So that's exciting to see how these effects are going to have on the bird in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and your presentation today. And we need to stay on track, and we'll switch to our next presentation. Our next speaker is Gabe Cahalan and he is a conservation steward and fire manager, excuse me, for the Nature Conservancy. Gabe is going to be talking about the implications of a fire history project in Maryland. All right, Gabe, are you ready to go?
I am. Good morning. Let me share my screen. All right, are my slides up?
Yep, we can see your slides. Go right ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Gabe Cahalan. I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'll be joined today in this presentation by Dr. Lauren Howard from Arcadia University, Samantha Myers, a co-author and currently a graduate student at University of Massachusetts, who was a burn crew member at the controlled burn in the title slide that you can see, will be available to answer questions with us at the end. Our other co-authors, Ricky Rosenthal, Jacqueline Hansen, Catherine Haynes, Carly McElroy, are all Arcadia University students. Here on the title slide, we have a picture of a fire scar at the top and a controlled burn at one of the fire history sites we'll be talking about today. We study fire history for a lot of reasons, but one that stands out for me is that members of the general public seem to relate to tree rings. Here, we had a public viewing station where we served coffee and sandwiches, talked to visitors about fire history while a controlled burn was taking place in the background at one of the fire history sites on the Nature Conservancy Preserve adjacent to the interstate. We're out on the landscape managing fire in this area, and so fire history provides context and insight into changing forest conditions. This hillside in the background here is the other fire history site that we'll be showcasing this morning, the Sideling Hill Wildlife Management Area, which is owned by the state of Maryland. Here's the same site 3 months later after the controlled burn. Again, the second fire history site is this hillside behind the field. So these sites are adjacent to Sideling Hill. We can see the road cut in Sideling Hill, which is the first major hill encounter traveling east to west in the ridge and valley of the Appalachian region of Maryland in the U.S. In the United States. This was originally a trail probably used and maintained by Massawomack and Shawnee. Fire in this area was made illegal starting in the 1700s by multiple bills introduced first by the colonial government, then by the new state of Maryland right after the formation of the United States in the 1790s. These bills to make fire in the woods illegal were probably to protect timber interests for the charcoal industry, which was feeding the iron furnaces in the area. As you will see later in this presentation, the laws from the 1700s didn't stop fires from occurring. However, in the early part of the 20th century, a system of fire suppression was put in place with staffed fire towers across the entire state, with one of those towers sited on Sideling Hill, which is still there today. We can see on the landscape today how effective fire suppression is in this area by looking at records for the last 30 to 40 years. Most of the landscape has had 0 fires during this period. The yellow circles on this map represent fire size, and the 2 fire sites represented by the blue outlines are about 5 kilometers apart, and they're separated by Interstate 68, which is this road on the map. Now I'll turn it over to Lauren Howard to talk about methods and some of our results.
Thanks, Gabe. In order to get a fire history for these 2 sites, north and south of Interstate 68, we went out and we searched for fire-scarred trees. On the landscape where we were, most of these were on southern and western slopes, and the majority of them were actually on trees that are dead now, but survived fires, hundreds of years ago when they were happening. The trees have to survive fires in order to record the burn in their wound wood. So this tree in the upper right, this slide, looks like it was cut at some point, but the stump is still there. And then down below, Gabe has just used this chainsaw to make a plunge cut and take out a piece of a living tree that has multiple fire scars on it. So I would say probably about 80% of our trees were already dead. And so they're actually disappearing from the landscape as they slowly rot away. Some of them are standing, many of them are down. They're either stumps or logs. Go ahead, Gabe, and give me the next slide, please. So that piece that Gabe was holding in the last slide was processed like all of our other samples. We brought them back to our laboratories. If they were breaking apart in the field, we glued them back together, and then we sanded them with a progression of sandpaper, starting at like 40 grit, which is very, very coarse, and ending at 400 or 600 grit, which is extremely polished. So you get detail like that, where underneath the microscope, we've seen in previous presentations, you get really good views of the fire scars. And you can also scan them using a high resolution scanner and work with those images using some software called Coup Recorder and C-Dendro. We can measure the ring widths, and each sample then has like a thumbprint of different wide and narrow ring widths, which can be compared. Now at the bottom, what we see is with the red line is the graph of ring widths for that sample. And the black line is the reference chronology made from other trees in the area. You can see a really high degree of correlation here, which means that we've dated this sample properly. We're not missing any years. We can be pretty confident in the dates of the fire scars that we see there on the sample. So we cross-date all the samples for accuracy. Next, please. Once you have this for a lot of trees, you can put them together into a fire history diagram like we've seen in other presentations, but also here. I've circled that sample from the previous slide in a blue rectangle here on the slide. And the horizontal line represents the portion of the timeline that's covered by that sample. And each vertical tick mark that's a solid tick mark is a fire scar. You can look at the timeline at the bottom to see when those happened. The open boxes, vertical boxes, those are wounds, injuries of some sort, might be connected with fire. The one that Gabe is circling there at the top on sample number 83 may have been wounds due to other things like lightning strikes, but they didn't look like fire scars to us. Once we have a graph like this, what we can do is we can look at the composite at the bottom and look at the amount of time that occurs between fires, or the mean fire interval. Here, the mean fire interval is extremely short. This is the site south of Interstate 68. And on average, every 2 years between 1711 and 1970, something was on fire here. Now, this statistic actually comes from any tree, it could be just a single tree showing a fire scar in a particular year. But if we were looking at burns that hit multiple trees in the same year, that mean fire interval actually lengthens a bit. Go ahead and give me the next slide there. So for example, 1926 is a year that actually scarred 16 of our trees. So that's probably a pretty extensive fire on the landscape compared to a year where there's only one tree showing a fire scar. There are 68 of these multi-scar fire years at this particular site south of Interstate 68. And the mean fire interval for those is 3.5 years apart. So it lengthens a little bit when you're looking at more extensive burns. And the dates of those multi-scar fire years, you can see at the bottom on the composite. Next, please. North of Interstate 68, we have a couple of sites that look like this. Again, we have a similar pattern where most of the fire is occurring in the 1800s, but we do get back to the 1700s. In the previous site, it was 1711 was the first fire we recorded. Here it's 1717. But north of the interstate, the major fires are pretty much over by the early 20th century, whereas they last into the mid 20th century south of the interstate. North of the interstate here, we have a mean fire interval multi-scar fire years of about 7 years. It's about twice as long as they are south of the interstate. Next. We can ask the question, why are fires burning in these years? And one of our hypotheses had to do with them being drought years. We were able to get the mean Palmer Drought Severity Index, or PDSI, which is here on the y-axis. PDSI, a positive PDSI value indicates a wetter and cooler year, whereas a negative one indicates a hotter and drier year. And what we did is we took and lumped or superimposed all the fire dates that we had for multi-scar fire years and put them into, we call a superposed epoch analysis. Down on the x-axis, you see year 0 would be the year of a burn. So all 58 fire years from one of our sites are superimposed together there. What we see is the average PDSI for those fire years is significantly hotter and drier than it is in the average year. That's also true the year before the fire at -1, although not significantly so. So what this analysis is indicating is we have a correlation between hot and dry PDSI and our multi-scar fire years at the site south of Interstate 68. If we look north of Interstate 68, interestingly enough, we don't see that drought signal in year 0, but what we do see is a wetter, cooler trend in the years before these fires. And we scratched our heads about that, thought about it, and what we think is going on is that in the past, that forest was probably more open, and it had like a graminoid, like grass and sedge component that probably, what responded to increased rainfall, grew a lot of fine fuels, which then dried out the following year and burned. Again, this wet trend 1 year before the fires is significant. It's significantly wetter than the average year. Next. Another indicator of drought that we looked at was whether or not the fire years were in an El Nino year. If you're from the American Southwest, you'll know that El Nino years are pretty wet down there, but in the northeastern United States, we have drought conditions during El Nino years typically. Here, what we see, and this is a combined superposed epoch analysis of both north and south sites. For fire years that scar 3 or more trees, there's a significant connection with El Nino. So you notice that bar goes above the 0 line. Positive on this graph indicates drought, which is the opposite of the previous graph. But yeah. Bottom of or lower than the axis indicates wet, upper in this case indicates El Nino year dry. And I'll hand it back to Gabe to go into El Nino in a little bit more detail.
All right, so on this chart, El Nino years are in red, La Nina in blue. So this is kind of just another way to look at the same data. And the 6 strongest El Nino events between 1871 and 1949 all had fire years with multiple trees scarred. Next, let's take a look closer at 2 specific El Nino years or events, 1905 and 1926. The way we can do this is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. It can be used to view the spatial pattern of drought. It allows looking at drought on shorter timescales than PDSI. Here we are looking at the spring, March through May of an El Nino year, 1905. It was a multi-scar fire year at our northern site. The Southwest and California are experiencing a wetter than normal spring, while Maryland is in the midst of a drought. Here again, we're looking at the spring of 1926 this time. This is at the southern site that had 16 fire-scarred trees that Lauren highlighted earlier. Again, we see higher precipitation in the Southwest, and our fire history site is in the middle of another drought period. The Washington Post on April 23rd included these headlines: "Thousands fight blazes in nearby Maryland counties." The fire regime at the site included years of what was probably mosaic fire spread, punctuated by more complete fire spread during the drier years. We can see that fire occurrence dropped off quickly in the middle of the 20th century. What does all this have to do with pine trees? Let's take a closer look at fire occurrence and forest composition. So this is from Samantha Meyer's capstone project, and she's joined us here today for questions. She used pith dates to match tree regeneration to the fire history at the site closer to the highway. Fires by decade are shown in the black line, and tree species are the bars. Table Mountain pine regenerated after frequent fire periods, and we can see an influx of white pine, which has thin bark during the first 20 years of growth and does better with a longer fire-free period. So we think, in conclusion, we think some of our sites had a more open canopy with probably more grasses and berries. Fire-adapted pines and oaks were regenerating in the gaps. Most of the forest in the region today has had an extremely long fire-free period and has closed canopy with a mesic mid-story filling in with very little grass or herbaceous component in the understory. The fire regime at these sites was more complex than we anticipated. Fire return intervals were different even at sites less than 5 kilometers apart. Looking to the future, we also need to consider site-specific challenges when designing prescriptions, while keeping in mind that we may be reintroducing fire after extremely long fire-free periods. We have a lot of folks to thank, and thank you for attending today. And with that, we'll take questions.
All right, Gabe and Lauren, thank you so much for that presentation. We have about 2 minutes remaining for questions from the audience. You can put those questions either directly in the chat in Whova or in the Q&A in Whova, and we will get to those. Really interesting project. Thanks for sharing it with us today. I love how these kinds of fire history stories can really, at least from my perspective, challenge assumptions and really make you rethink how much fire an ecosystem or a landscape has seen in the past. What did you have? 3.4 mean fire interval on the sites is just, it's amazing and mind-blowing. So let's check here the Q&A chat. So have you had any feedback from managers or from locals, or if you've had chances to share these results with them?
We really, this is the first time we're sharing it. We really just kind of started wrapping up the project right before the conference here. So yeah, we haven't had a chance. There were a number of surprises. The correlation with El Nino, the just amazingly short fire interval, and then the difference between sites that are so close. Of course, they're separated by roads, so that probably explains some of it, but probably different management happening at different pieces of private property by different owners over time.
Well, great. It'll be fun to hear how things go as you guys are able to share these findings, because It's a really interesting project, and thank you for sharing it with all of us today. All right,
you.
to stay on time, we're going to move on to our next presenter. So thanks again. Coming up next, we have Jean Huffman. And Jean is a research associate at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. Jean will be talking about her work of looking at past fire regimes in the longleaf pine ecosystems of the Gulf Coastal Plain. So Jean, are you here and are you ready?
Okay, next slide.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about fire history work in the longleaf pine and southeastern longleaf pine savannas. It's a region with the most prescribed fire, but with some of the least knowledge of fire history. Next. In the West, there are hundreds, and also in other regions of North America, there are hundreds of fire histories, but in the Southeast, there are very few. Next. And there are even fewer in the longleaf pine flatwoods. So this is a map of the ranges of flatwood systems that occur along the coast. And there are so far no published studies of fire history. Next. So one of the reasons there's such a lack of that there's such a lack of fire histories. There are many reasons. I won't go into all of them, but one is that the longleaf pine is so fire resistant and generally doesn't produce the external scars that are used in a lot of other studies, as well as that there are few old trees and few old wood like stumps. But we found in collecting stumps that had been uprooted that if you sample very low to the base, you can sometimes find a lot of scars at the ground level. And these are buried basal fire scars like you see in the picture. Next. So today I'm going to present some preliminary results from a fire history construction from some coastal longleaf pine flatwoods. Next. Our study site is the Tyndall Air Force Base, and that's on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Let me see. I guess I can't point, but the second image down, you see that it's on a peninsula surrounded by water. And then on the right picture, you see the yellow is the study site. It's about 1 kilometer from the bay on one side and only about 3 kilometers to the Gulf of Mexico. Next. Our study site, we were lucky to find some old stumps. Most areas in the Southeast, not only were the old trees cut, but the stumps were removed. So this was a lucky find to find an area that not only had some stumps, but had a concentration of stumps in a small area. Next. So we collected these stumps, and in order to cut the basal section near the ground where the fire scars occur, in flatwoods, we have to actually excavate them because longleaf pine in wet sites like flatwoods make large lateral roots that make it impossible to just, dig around and take a section. Next. So I'll go through all the other methods really quickly so we can get to the results. And then next. Next. Okay, so we surfaced the sections, measured all the rings, and produced a growth chronology that could date the rings to the year. And that's a little more detail on the methods that I won't go into, so we can get on with it next. We numbered and recorded the year and the interannual position for all the fire scars. So there are a lot of scars in here, and not all of them are scars, but there are criteria that we use to determine what's a fire scar, and only the fire scars were counted. Next. So the results are our growth chronology to date these stumps turned out. We dated 30 of the trees, and the chronology went from the late 1400s, 1491 to 1839, almost 350 years. When we also produced a fire scar chronology, and that went from the first fire scar in 1517 to the last scar in 1814, which is close to 300 years. This is from 14 of the stumps, and had a lot of scars. The scars per tree varied from 6 to 95. Next. So you've seen this before. Each line is a tree, each vertical is a fire scar, vertical hatch mark is a fire scar. Next. And at the bottom is the scar composite that shows all the fire years, and the mean fire interval for the entire scar period is 1.34 years. Next. Of course, there's variation in the number of trees that we have recording the scars. Next. Next. Go through about 4 or 5 nexts. Okay, go ahead. Oops, back. Sorry. Go through again with those. Okay, so you can see that when there are a lot of trees recording, and what I call a recording tree is if it has 2 or more scars during the specified period. When it has 6 to 12 trees recording, the mean fire interval goes down to just 1.1. So we found that extremely frequent fires, that periods when there were less trees recording, 3 to 5 trees, still the mean fire interval was 1.4 to 1.9. But this is also with not a real lot of trees yet. As more trees come into this, there will probably be even more frequent fire frequency. Next. And there's another aspect that will likely up the fire frequency in this, and that is biannual fires. So we did find trees with more than 1 fire scar in a year. Both that and fire years that had different seasons indicating different fires. This has not been put into the frequency calculations yet because it's basically a new thing. And Michael Stambaugh has also found sites of longleaf pine with biannual fires and has developed a methodology for calculating that in, which can't be done with normal fire history software. So that is something that we will do in the future, and will probably make the fire frequency more than once a year. Next. But the bottom line is that this is the site of very, very frequent fire. Next. So the second part of the what we learned about fire regimes from these trees was the seasonal timing. So an annual, this just to show annual growth ring is early wood and late wood is 1 year. Next. Next. We use scar positions that we established by doing cambial phenology work and making a fire scar seasonality system that you can see Rother et al. Here 2018. And it divides the early wood into 2 sections, the late wood into 2 sections, and the transition that's between the early wood and late wood and dormant between the late wood and early wood. Next. This allowed us to know the season of wood formation and to pinpoint when the main lightning strike season versus non-lightning strike occurred. Next. And all these figures are from Rother et al. This shows the lightning frequency for the county adjacent to the site and the lightning fire frequency. And you can see that this transition period and early late wood encompasses the peak of both lightning and lightning fires. Next. So this is the results of our seasonal determinations. 60 of the total of 427 scars, 65 couldn't be determined, weren't clear. We only used ones that were clear. And of the ones that could be determined, this is just the raw number of fire scars. By far the most occurred in the transition season, with some also in the early late wood and a few distributed through the 6 positions. Next. And this corresponds, these 2 positions correspond, as you saw in the last slide, to the lightning season. Next. And of course, the lightning fire and lightning strike. Next. So we then looked at the distribution over time of the seasonal scars, and to see if there was a change over the time period. And this is, again, the absolute number of scars, and there's not a clear trend really. Next. It seemed that the transition fires and early late wood fires really occurred during the entire time period. Next. So to summarize, at this coastal pine flatwood site during the 1500s to 1700s, we found extremely frequent fire, hyper frequent fire that occurred mostly in the lightning season and actually mostly in the early lightning season. And these results confirm what climate-based studies predict about regional fire regimes here. Next. These studies were really encouraged by fire managers who determine the fire regimes completely now in the natural areas in the southeast. And hopefully this new information will be helpful to them in determining frequency and possibly season the burn and the prescribed fire regimes. Next. So these new methods of fire history reconstruction that are being necessary to develop in longleaf systems with their hyper frequent fire, they're really coming along, and soon there are going to be many more tree ring based fire history reconstructions for the southeast coastal plain, hopefully giving us a lot better understanding of fire regimes of the past that shape these super fiery southeast pine savanna landscapes. Okay, next. I'd like to thank Dan Childs and Melanie Kaiser, people at Tyndall Air Force Base that facilitated all of this, and all the rest of these listed people. And as I said, the fire managers that are interested in doing the best fire management they can. Next. Okay, questions?
All right, Jean. Well, I'm glad we were able to get the
I'm
presentation to
sorry.
work for
Sorry
you.
for
This
I
Oh,
didn't-
no worries. Fascinating presentation. Thank you for sharing with us. We have just about a minute or so for questions from the audience. So I want
sorry.
to jump right into them. So here's one from Lauren in Hoover. And Lauren says the short fire frequency of about 1 year is incredible. How many fire-free years in a row does longleaf pine need to be able to shoot from the grass stage to a height where it can survive? Did you see any connection between the gaps in fire history and recruitment of longleaf pine individuals?
This
she
is
said.
really interesting, and that longleaf pine doesn't need a very big gap. And when fire is so frequent as this, fires become patchy. So that's one of the reasons we may have more than one fire in a year. Even in that small area, there can be patchiness when the fires are so frequent. So even though in a 3-hectare area, we had annual fire, it doesn't mean it burnt everywhere. And so even with annual fire, you can get longleaf recruitment. Longleaf is really suited to recruiting in frequent fire places.
All right, well, thank you. And if y'all have additional questions for Jean, please, she had her email up there on the screen, or you can type them into Hoover and connect with her. So Jean, thank you so much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. Fascinating work, tremendous amount of work. We do need to stay on time, so we'll move on to our next speaker. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Andrew Merschel, and he is an ORISE postdoctoral scholar with the U.S. Forest Service. And Andrew is going to be taking us across the country and up to the Western Cascades of Oregon and Washington State for our next presentation. So Andrew, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you and we can see your slides, so go right ahead. Thank you.
Cool. So thanks everyone for joining me today. What I'm going to do is present an overview of a large effort to reconstruct historical fire regimes in the Western Cascades of Oregon and Washington in temperate coniferous forests, where Douglas fir here is our predominant shading tolerant and fire tolerant species. This is going to be a challenging presentation for me today because this study is still in its early stages. My aim here is to network with the fire history crowd, generate interest in the study, and get feedback from you guys on its methodology and what our next steps might be going forward. So I want to link back to what everybody else has sort of mentioned in these talks in our session. We are lacking cross-dated fire histories in the Pacific Northwest in all of the forested area that's west of the Cascades. So in this slide, I'm showing you the distribution of ponderosa pine and the existing cross-dated fire history studies, which are pretty much restricted to the range of ponderosa pine, where it's relatively easy to find well-preserved fire scars and reconstruct multi-century histories. As we move into the west side and we're in our Douglas fir rainforest, we have a lot of additional challenges that makes fire histories absent in this region. The first is that we have a really wet climate. And that means when trees do form fire scars, especially large ones, they often rot and decay and we can't recover them. These are extremely productive forests, so our fire scars are often going to be grown over and concealed. We're not seeing the traditional cap faces we find in pine forests. And then these Douglas fir have enormously thick fire resistant bark. So a lot of the low and moderate severity fires that may be occurring are not going to be recorded on a lot of the trees. Finally, this is a system that does have a good component of stand replacing fire that's going to come through and periodically remove records. So this all adds up to being a very labor intensive process. And the researchers preceding us did most of their work in the 1990s in recent clear cuts when they were abundant in the Western Cascades. And the thought at the time was that high severity fire was the predominant type of fire that was influencing forest development. So they elected to do ring counts on stumps. And while they were doing this, they uncovered lots of evidence for low and moderate severity fire at pretty high frequencies, particularly in the lee side of the Coast Range and then also in the Central and Southwest Cascades. And their major takeaway was that we needed to do a much better cross-data approach if we were really going to understand the way fire influences forest dynamics in the region. So some limitations of these earlier studies that were doing ring counts is that they had a mean error for dating the fire scars and the pith dates on these trees of about 25 years. Looking at this stump that I surfaced here with a chainsaw, you can imagine just how hard it would be to accurately assign a year to these fire scars and this pith date by counting this in the field. When we don't have a cross-dated study, we can't relate our fire years to climate, and that's really one of our first steps we take to understanding how a fire regime operates, understanding that climate driver. The next thing we can't do is calculate our traditional metrics to describe a fire regime. So we can't talk about fire size or fire frequency or estimate the severity in different fire events over time if we can't assign precise years for them. So here's where we're at currently on the west side of Oregon and Washington. We have 34 plots in the Southwest Cascades that I put in for my dissertation research. I'll share some of the data from those plots today, and then an additional 16 sites that James Johnston has developed. But largely, as we go from the south to the north, there's no existing cross-dated reconstructions that have used direct evidence of fire dated to its exact year. So what we have right now in our understanding of fire in these Douglas fir forests is just a model of fire regimes that's predominantly informed by climate and lightning ignitions. And you can see that this model transitions from a frequent low severity fire regime to an infrequent high severity fire regime as you move further north in latitude and into the Coast Range. This figure here on the left is from the Northwest Science Synthesis by Spies. And this was acknowledging that there's actually quite a bit of moderately frequent or frequent mixed severity fire in the region. The problem with this model is that we don't know what the term frequency means or mixed severity. So without data feeding into this, we don't understand the balance of low, moderate, and high severity fire and how that fire severity might be patterned on the landscape. I think something that really challenges me is we don't know what the drivers are in this fire regime. The map on the left is essentially made up of climate and lightning, but we know that in this region, there's some other factors that are influencing the fire regime that we haven't yet handled. So I'm going to unpack those a little bit more. Those are east wind events, vegetation structure and composition, and then traditional burning. So I'm going to start out with climate. These are some results from my study in the Southwest Cascades, 34 different reconstruction sites. And real briefly, what I want to highlight here is that fire-climate relationships in these forests, at least with the data we have right now, have not been stable over time. They've been non-stationary. So in the pre-settlement period, we did not see a significant drought departure in fire years, but after 1830, when the settlement period begins, what we see is a strong, significant drought departure in the fire year. So basically, fire-climate relationships have not been stable over time. So let's think a little bit more about why that might be. One of the other factors are east winds. So a lot of people are familiar with the 2020 Labor Day fires that we recently had in the Pacific Northwest. These fires happen under really high winds with really low humidity. They're very extensive with a lot of high severity burned area within them. They recently happened, and there's lots of evidence that they've happened historically a couple times per century. And this is interesting because these aren't necessarily climate events, they're weather events. So some of our big fire events may not have a strong climate signal because of this. I want to follow that up with a discussion about how forest age and structure might matter. These are two east wind fire events, the Tillamook fire and the Cult fire. And what I want you to see in this figure is that after these initial big fire events happened, there were lots of reburns that followed them up. And the thought behind these reburns is that an early seral Douglas fir forest has much lower humidity, much higher temperatures, much higher wind speeds, and the fuels that are going to be much more flammable. And this results in increased fire after you get your initial high severity event. Again, this suggests that we may not have stable fire frequencies over time or climate as our peer driving factor. Following up a little bit more of this with some historical data from the Southwest Cascades. This is data from my calf reconstruction site. It's in the Pacific Silver Fir zone, which is a very wet part of the Western Cascades. And real briefly, what I want to summarize here is that when this was a young forest after a severe fire in 1719, there were 6 fire events within the first 100 years of its development when Douglas fir was establishing. As it transitioned to a mature forest with a tall canopy and the establishment of shade-tolerant species in the understory, that's when the fire frequency abruptly decreased. And as we've been going across the Western Cascades, another supporting piece of evidence that we see is during the early stages of the Douglas fir cohort establishment, we find lots of fire scars within the first 50 to 100 years on these trees that we're sampling. The last point I'd like to highlight, and connecting back to what Dan said, is we really haven't incorporated the importance and role of traditional burning by Native American cultures in the region. Traditional burning was essential to food and textile production and harvest. And just some more results from the Southwest Cascades. This is from one of my reconstruction sites. And what I'm showing you is fires over time and the relationship to climate. So each one of these blue dots indicates a fire event, and the periods in blue are cool, wet summers, and the periods in red are hot, dry summers. And I'm highlighting this period between 1800 to 1820. This is a period where throughout the Pacific Northwest, we see very little fire, and it's a time where we don't have summer drought. What's really interesting about this Oak Flat site is there's a ton of fire during this cool, wet period where we don't see fire elsewhere. You'll also notice that it has an extremely high fire return interval, or frequent fire return interval, of about 3 years. This continues up until the year 1856, when Native American cultures were removed from the region. And what you see after that time period is a very steep decline in the fire frequency, and we no longer see fires in cool, wet years. I think this is really important because this site is actually quite a ways up in the Western Cascades. It's in the Western Hemlock zone. And so this isn't really a dry forest. This is a really wet, productive forest that had hyper frequent fire historically. And so we may need to consider how that's influencing the fire regime, even in our temperate rainforest systems. Okay, now I'm going to move on to our actual West Side fire history study. Our objectives are to quantify variability in pre-settlement fire frequency and fire severity. Next, we want to characterize the major developmental pathways of forest structure and composition. And then we'd like to characterize our linkages between climate variability and fire occurrence. So that last step is really important to being able to unpack our other drivers of fire within the region. So our sample design for this study is pretty simple and straightforward. We're starting off with the plots we already have established. And what we did is we located 100 plots across Western Oregon and Washington in different Forest Service ranger districts. The only criteria we have on these plots is that they're within 750 meters from a road, and that allows us the access and the feasibility of getting the samples out of the site. Other than that, this is really just casting a broad net to take the pulse of fire across a large region. Currently, we've sampled somewhere around 40 plots, and we hope to add an additional 30 out of the 100 that we selected. So our sampling design, once we have our sample plot selected, we look at air photos of the point, and we select an area that has a harvested area or a clear cut that's adjacent to a stand with no management. So within that clear cut, which is just outside the unharvested area that's in the background of this photo, what we're doing is we're collecting cross sections from 15 to 20 stumps and logs that contain fire scars. So just a few photos of how that goes. What we're scouring and systematically working across these clear cuts, blowing the tops off of these, in many cases, really old stumps, and then carefully dissecting them, taking multiple samples to get as many fires as we can out of them. After that, we move into the unharvested forest that's directly outside, and we record forest structure and composition. And that's going to give us an opportunity to go back to these plots and learn about how the fires that we reconstructed influence forest development over time. So I'm going to wrap up today with some preliminary results from just one of our sites. On this chart, what I'm showing you is a timeline for each tree collected at site 68. The tree timelines are color-coded by species. So this is a mixture of Douglas fir with a few western hemlock. As in other presentations, the fire scars are indicated by these vertical tick marks, and each vertical tick mark corresponds to something that we're absolutely positive is a fire scar wound. We're also tracking suppression events. So we have a fire in 1522 that's recorded on several trees in the stand. And there's also trees in the stand that show a very distinct ring width suppression immediately after that fire. So that's what this S stands for. We do the same thing for releases that are associated with a fire scar in the sample plot. And finally, as others have shown, we're also tracking injuries over time. In most cases, these are probably due to mechanical damage, but we want to just make sure they do or do not line up with our fire scars at the site. So our next steps for this study, we're going to add an additional 25 to 30 fire history reconstruction plots. Most of those are going to be focused in the Mount Hood National Forest and the Mount Baker Snow Colony. We're rapidly summarizing our fire records, and once we have that done, we're going to identify landscapes that represent the observed gradient of fire frequencies across our study area, and then we're going to drill down into those different fire frequencies and reconstruct fire severity, patch dynamics, and fire's influence on forest development within those landscapes. So to wrap up, I just want to really give a big thanks to our crew, Sven, Micah, and Anna, who did a fantastic job doing the labor of cutting these cross sections and are becoming great dendrochronologists in our lab today. And with that, I'll open it up for some questions and discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate your presentation. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A. You can put those questions either in the chat in Whova or in the Q&A in Whova, and we will try and get to those. Looks like we already have one question in from Joe. And Joe says, Andrew, curious how fire records of individual trees compared to site composite records. He says, any evidence of trees growing out of a size likely to record fires? He says, from your photos, it looked like some recorded mini fires in early portions of their records. Interesting that your and Gene studies both end up often used systems of recording versus not recording.
Thanks, Joe. I think that's a really good question and something we're definitely going to pay attention to. We do see this pattern of most fires early in the development of these Douglas fir forests, and it could be because that's when there is higher fire frequency. It also could be because they record fire, they have less ability to record fire when they're large old Douglas fir. The one thing that makes me feel confident we're getting the full fire records is that if you look across a study area where you have lots of plots, you see that different age classes, when they are present and young and should record fires at a site, they still don't. So you see that even when you have young trees available to record fire and your old trees don't record fire, there's correspondence there. But it is something that we want to sample more sites to really be sure that there are these changes in fire frequency over time, and it's not a change in the tree's ability to record fire.
Here's another question that we had that came in from Matt, and Matt is asking a specific, where is site 68?
Site 68 is at pretty high elevation out of our sites. It's on the eastern side of the Willamette National Forest, somewhere around 4,000 feet. So if you're familiar with the area, basically where the higher Cascade Plateau starts. I think I can maybe bring up a map of that. It's right over here.
All right, thanks. 100 plots is an impressive effort for your project. And coming from the east, the bar on those chainsaws shows the amount of work that goes into this project.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways we're learning as we go with these challenges in Douglas fir, and we've had to completely oversize our equipment both in the field and in the shop to get this done. So at some point, it seems like we might need a methodology paper to document how we're doing things differently.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation today. We're going to try and wrap things up on time. If we were all in a room together, I would say let's do one more round of applause for all of our speakers from the fire history session today. Really enjoyed your presentations, and all of you are helping to challenge how we think and really understand fire on the landscape, all the way down from Gene's work in the southeastern part of the United States up to Gabe and Lauren's work in Maryland, across the central part of the country, and up into the Northern Rockies. So thank you all so much. As a fire groupie, please keep up the good work, and I love reading your papers and following the work that you're doing.